Good morning. I'm Bill Messner, and you're not, an old Chevy Chase line. And this is the Civil War's impact on Talbot County. And of course, the irony of that topic is that there was no war in terms of fighting in Talbot County. But we're going to discuss it anyway, okay? And hopefully the reasons for that will become clear as we go along. I'm learning along with you. Okay, I claim no great expertise in this specific topic. In fact, that's the reason I'm teaching it, because I learn best doing this, not doing what you're doing. Okay, I came down here 7 years ago from the North Country, and I didn't have a clue about a lot of things, but particularly I didn't have a clue about Talbot County. In fact, I had never heard of Talbot County before I got here, and no sense of the Civil War and what might have occurred here in the years 1861 to 1865. But I've had a lifelong interest in the Civil War, going all the way back when I was a kid. I have clear recollection of my father and one of his good friends debating what was the most important battle of the Civil War. And after they had a few Manhattans, they'd really get into it. My father was a Gettysburg man, and Uncle Al was an Antietam man, and they go back and forth. And I thought, well, this is interesting. They're not arguing about the Yankees and the Giants. Maybe I need to school myself a little bit. So I did. And over the years, I studied more and more, went to the University of Wisconsin, got a doctorate out there, and focused on Civil War history, not military history. I've really never been much interested in military history. And that's not to denigrate it. It just wasn't my area of interest. My area of interest has always been more social and the like. And I particularly focused on, of all places, Louisiana during the Civil War. I am the world's expert on the Civil War in Louisiana, June 1862. Okay? I also know a lot about July, but I don't claim expertise in July. But I knew nothing about Talbot County, nothing at all. And I began to learn. I began to poke into history of Talbot County and the Eastern Shore as a whole. And I found that, geez, this is an interesting place. And one of the primary reasons it's interesting is that it doesn't fit any stereotype, any model that I had ever come across. It wasn't North. It wasn't South. It was, as one history of Maryland has put it for the state as a whole, the middle way. And even that, I think, is not entirely accurate relative to Talbot County, because Talbot County, in my estimation at least, is largely different from any other place in the state. And particularly largely different from any other place in Maryland on the Eastern Shore, at least as I get around and poke into the history, and not just the history, but current events as well. So when Lynn put out a call for courses for this semester, is this a semester? Okay, this is a semester, whatever this is. I thought, gee, this is an opportunity to delve into this area that I've always been interested in, Civil War, and this new area that I'm learning about, Talbot County, and see if we can mesh the two.
Do you have a screen to change?
I will do that. Thank you. Okay, but I'm not there yet. I'm not going to make a smart ass remark at this point, Lynn, but another 15, 20 minutes, I'll get there. Okay, so Civil War. The Civil War, in my estimation, and many other historians' estimation, was the transformative event of American history. Things changed as a result of the Civil War, and things would never be the same in this country after 1865. And historians have written volumes about the way in which the Civil War was a transformative event. Certainly in terms of the South, there's no argument that the South was devastated as a function of the Civil War. At least 250,000 lives were lost in the South during the Civil War. Equal number were lost in the North. But for the South, with a much smaller population, 250,000, 260,000 lives being lost, bulk much larger than it did in the North. Beyond the loss of human lives, the economic devastation wrought by the war was incredible. Physical devastation throughout those areas in which many battles were fought. Sherman's march to the sea, that you're all familiar with, just devastated portions of the South. Billions of dollars were lost, and then a wholesale transformation in how labor was accomplished in the South. 4.5 million enslaved people suddenly were transformed into quote unquote free laborers who could at least theoretically say, I ain't working here anymore, I'm leaving. Now, whether that in fact occurred in practice is another question. But certainly if you read the diaries and the letters of farmers / planters here in Maryland and in Talbot County, you'll find that there was a dramatic alteration in labor relations as a result of the Civil War. We'll get into some of that next week as we delve into the war's impact, particularly on Black labor. In the North, you had a very different situation. Certainly, there was loss of life. There's no doubt about that. Again, another 250 to 300 to 350,000 men lost in the war. Interesting thing about that loss of life, both North and South, in the Civil War, most of it, the large majority of it, didn't occur because someone was shot during a battle. 2/3 of the folks, the men, who died during the Civil War Died because of what? Excuse me? Infection, disease. And much of that disease didn't even have to do with being wounded. It had to do with being put in god-awful conditions with little or no medical attention. And as a result, you got death. But beyond that, the North, in fact, if you survived the Civil War, thrived as a function of the war. Now, there's been a debate among economic historians exactly how much of the North's growth, and the North after the Civil War grew remarkably, grew dramatically. How much of that was due to the war itself, and how much would have occurred anyway. And that's, of course, always a difficult issue to try to parse what would have happened if this hadn't occurred. Excuse me. But to simply look at the list of things that occurred during the war itself, which I think most folks would argue would never have happened if there wasn't a war, such as the first income tax was passed during the Civil War, a high tariff which protected American manufacturers and allowed them to develop and grow, occurred during the Civil War. The Homestead Act occurred during the Civil War. Aid to railroads occurred during the Civil War. A creation, first time, of a U.S. currency during the Civil War. A standing army. Never had a standing army. Occurred during the Civil War. Why was a standing army significant? Because it was used after the Civil War, out west in particular, to subdue indigenous populations and to open up portions of the West to development. I think it's incontrovertible that much of that wouldn't have occurred. Why wouldn't it have occurred? Why wouldn't it have occurred if there hadn't been those pieces of federal legislation? Who passed them? Who passed them? Excuse me? What party was in power during the Civil War? The Republican Party, okay? Who wasn't there in Congress during the Civil War? Yeah, much of the Democratic Party wasn't there. They were down there in the South. They had seceded from the Union. And so the Republican Party had full sway to pretty much pass any legislation it wanted, and this is what it wanted. All right, moving on. How was Talbot County impacted? Interesting. We said that Talbot, that the Civil War did not, in a military sense, impact Talbot County. That dotted line that you can see going across is an indication of where military events, if you want to call it that, fighting, occurred in Maryland during the Civil War. And you can see it stretched from in the east, from the Baltimore area, all the way to the west, to the Cumberland area, across the entire state in the north, and nothing in the south. Why that occurred that way is an interesting question that I can't answer, but it did. And so certainly Talbot County, from a military standpoint, escaped much of the devastation that other areas of the state experienced. The Battle of Antietam, bloodiest battle in the Civil War, fought on Maryland soil. Okay, so let us then get into a little bit of the background of Talbot County. This handsome gentleman is Edward Lloyd V. Why do I put up Edward Lloyd V? And quite frankly, one of the reasons I put up Edward Lloyd V is because I've got a picture of Edward Lloyd V. I don't have a picture. If anybody's come across a picture of Edward Lloyd VII, I wouldn't give my arm for it, but I did pay you a lot of money. Okay. The Lords of Y, the Lloyd family. Who's familiar with the Lloyd family? Who's heard of the Lloyd family? Okay, about half of the class. At one time, if we were sitting here 100, 125 years ago, every hand would go up. Because the Lloyd family ruled this area of Maryland, and certainly Talbot County. The Y plantation over, what's that area of the county called? Excuse me? Yeah. The Lloyds were the largest slaveholders in the state of Maryland. They owned 700 to 800 slaves. They owned so many slaves that in the 1820s, 1830s, they said, we don't know what the hell to do with all these people. I have an idea. I'm going to buy a plantation or two or three in Georgia, and I think in Mississippi, and I'm going to ship 200 or 300 down there, which is what they did. And of course, they went down into Georgia and Mississippi because that's where the cotton economy was booming. It wasn't booming here in Maryland in the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1840s. The Lloyds ruled Talbot County. The Lloyds and the Lords of Y, which was a euphemism for the interlocking family that 10 or 15 largest slave owners here in Talbot County. Edward Lloyd V, the reason we have a picture of him is because he was governor of the state. He was a U.S. congressman. He was a U.S. senator. I mean, he just checked all the boxes. By the time of the Civil War, we have Edward Lloyd VII, who takes over for his father. I believe it was in 1861. His father dies, and Edward Lloyd VII takes over. And we'll probably talk about him a little later. So these families, the Lloyd family and relatives, pretty much ruled Talbot County before the Civil War. And no surprise, they are slaveholders. Interestingly, many slaveholders here in Talbot County got rid of their slaves in the years leading up to the Civil War. By 1860, half of the Black population of Talbot County was, quote unquote, free. And the reason for that was that the economy of Talbot County had changed. Talbot County and slavery had developed in the 1700s on the basis of a tobacco economy. Tobacco economy could use slave labor and use it profitably because there was always something to do. It was a very labor-intensive crop. By the 1800s, tobacco had gone that way. It had moved south. Better tobacco could be grown in the South and the Caribbean. And what had replaced it here in Talbot County? Well, yeah, wheat, corn, and the like. And those crops didn't need the same kind of intensive cultivation that tobacco needed. And so you had slave owners sitting there in June and July, or February and January, saying, what am I going to do with these 50 people? I've got to feed and house. What am I going to do with them for productive purposes? Now, some of them were rented out. There was a lot of renting of Black labor. In fact, some of the most famous of the Black population of that period were rented. But many owners just said, I'm giving it up. We're going to free them at a certain age and let them shift for themselves. And that's, in fact, what happened for many, but not the Lloyds. The Lloyds held on, and many of the other large slave owners held on. And an interesting question might be, why did they hold on? And for some, I think it was simply a matter of prestige that, along with owning all these human beings, you were perceived to be up here. You were a notable. So we have the Lloyds. The Lloyds and others like them were adherents of slavery, and therefore, as the 1850s roll on and the conflict between North and South develops, it's no mystery where the leadership of Talbot County, where their sentiments lie. There's Y House. I think, who's been in Y House? I never have been. Anybody can get me in, please. Do me a favor. Yeah. We have the presidential election of 1860. Let me just, there it is. I've sort of skipped over a little bit here, but I got a feeling I'm running. Okay. Yeah, there's one other fellow I wanted to mention, but I'm not seeing him here. There he is. Okay, we'll go back. One other fellow who was in evidence here in Talbot County in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was this gentleman, Franklin Buchanan. I have a feeling many of you are familiar with the name. If you head out to the area where the Y plantation is, just before you cross the river, I believe there's a sign, one of those historical markers pointing to the left down the road, that the residence of Franklin Buchanan is down this road. Buchanan's an interesting guy. He was a very, very notable naval officer in the 40s and 50s, took part in the Mexican War and covered himself in, accolades and glory. He took part in opening up Japan, which is to say the U.S. Navy steamed into Tokyo Harbor and said, "You will be open." All right. He was part of that process. And something I didn't know, he was the first superintendent of the Naval Academy. He wasn't very happy about that, but he was said, "You will be the superintendent." Okay, that's what I'll be. At the start, when the first, 6, 7 states of the Deep South seceded from the Union, Buchanan, who was a member at that point in time of the United States Navy, an officer, just assumed, along with many other folks, that Maryland was going to secede too. And so he handed in his resignation, saying, I love the United States of America. I'm a devoted member of the U.S. Navy, but I need to go where my state goes and my people, so to speak. And then something happened. What happened? Yeah, Maryland didn't secede. And so Buchanan says, "Oops." And he writes to Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy. By this time, Lincoln has been elected president, and says, I want to take it back. And Welles says, for reasons that, quite frankly, are inexplicable, "No, you can't have it back. You resigned. Sorry." Which was one of the bigger blunders that Welles made during the war, because Buchanan went on to play a role in the Merrimack, first ironclad. He didn't take part in the Monitor versus Merrimack battle itself. Someone else was at the helm for that battle. But he was involved in the development of the Monitor, and he was also involved in another ironclad, the Tennessee, that did a lot of damage to the United States Navy as well. So Franklin Buchanan.
Was he a slaveholder?
Excuse me?
Was he a slaveholder?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Excuse me? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was married to a Lloyd. Therefore, it's where he resided is it's not a coincidence that he was a stone's throw across the river from the Lloyds. Okay. So I need to go back then. There we go. So we have an election in 1860 at which secession is in the air. In fact, this election precipitated secession, with Lincoln being elected. And initially, the first 6 or 7 states saying, "We're out of here." Even though Lincoln went to great lengths to say, "I ain't gonna touch slavery." He said it during the election. He said it after the election. He said it for the first year of the Civil War. I will not touch slavery. And the South said, A, we don't believe you, or B, we don't care. Because we know even though you won't touch slavery in Alabama or Georgia, we know what you will do. And what would he do? Well, eventually. His position was, I cannot, constitutionally, I can't touch it where it exists, but I will not allow it to expand 1 inch, not 1 inch. And particularly, I will not allow it to expand into the territories in the West. And the South said, if we're not allowed to expand, slavery will die. We've seen it in Maryland. What's happening there? In Delaware, what's happening there? And the same thing is going to happen throughout the rest of the South eventually. It needs to be able to expand. In fact, the South had great visions of taking over not just portions of what we consider the West, but going south into Central and even South America and taking over portions of those areas as well, Mexico and the like, and expanding slavery there. But that wasn't going to happen with Lincoln. It wasn't going to happen with the Republican Party. Okay, so we have an election, and there are 4 candidates in this election. And it's fascinating to see what happened here in Talbot County. The largest number of votes in this election went for this guy up in the upper left-hand area, John Breckinridge. He got a little less than 50% of the votes. Breckinridge was the candidate of the fire eaters, which is to say that branch of the Democratic Party that was saying, if Lincoln's elected, we're out of here. He won here in Talbot County almost 50% of the vote, 40%, something like that. Coming in second was this guy to his right, John Bell. John Bell was also a Democrat, but he was a moderate Democrat. Bell was what? The constitutional unionist. I think prior to this, he had been a Democrat, but they put a new label on themselves, which is to say the constitutional unionists said, oh, let's sit down and, talk about this. We can come to some cooperative compromise. What that compromise was going to be was a little bit up in the air, but he was more moderate. And then down here in the left, coming in third place, was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was the candidate of the regular Democratic Party, okay? The ones that hadn't broken away. What did Douglas say? Come on, what did Douglas say? Stephen Douglas. Oh, sorry, folks. Douglas said, yeah, what we're going to do, we're going to let the people in the West decide for themselves whether there should be slavery out there or not, whether slavery should expand. We're not going to get involved. What do we know? Let the people in Kansas and Nebraska and all those, all those godforsaken places. They can decide for themselves. And then we had Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln said, it ain't expanding any place. Never, ever. Not if I'm elected. So Breckinridge took a plurality of the votes. Bell came in second. Douglas came in third. Lincoln, anybody know how many votes Lincoln got? 2. He got 2 votes. And we think we know who they were. We think. 2 guys by the name of Cogill. 2 guys by the name of Cogill, who bought a farm over right next to the Lloyd's plantation in the 1850s. And what did they do? Here you had the Lloyd's with 300-400 slaves. These 2 fellas said, we're going to work our land with free black workers, and we're going to treat them well. And of course, the Lloyds weren't too thrilled about that. But in any case, 2 votes for Lincoln. All right. What then happens? Let's see. Where we go here?
Bill?
Yes.
Were they Quakers? Yes.
Yes, they were Quakers. They were Quakers. They were Quakers, sort of. They were Quakers, except their son. I get the 2. They were James and John, and I get the 2 mixed up. But one of the sons becomes a soldier, enlists. He becomes an officer, and he kills people, which ain't the Quaker way. In fact, there's a whole story around it, but don't get me started on they're fascinating folks. Okay. So what happens here? The war breaks out, and here in Talbot County, these guys initially take control. Confederate forces, or at least Talbot County residents who put on military garb of one sort or another. The Oxford Rifles. Who's from Oxford? There you go. Seen any Oxford Rifles marching around lately in Confederate uniforms? Probably not. No, I wouldn't think so. That's very un-Oxford-y to do that sort of thing. Don't get me started on Oxford. Lovely place, lovely place. I like it a lot. But I also like to poke it a little bit now and then. Yeah, so initially, because of the Lloyds and other muckety-mucks were favorably disposed to the Confederate cause, folks followed. The common folk followed. About, I think it was 94. How do I know 94? Because I counted on the statue that disappeared in the middle of the night from the county building, the Talbot Boy statue. I think there were 94 names on it. Excuse me? 88, okay. 88 names. Yeah, did you count them? Yeah, all right. All right, well, we'll arm wrestle on that one. Okay. And the impression that has been then promulgated largely because of two reasons. Number one, that many of those names, 88, 94, on that statue were big shots. At least many of them were. And so they were notable names that people recognized. And also because it was on a statue, for God's sake. Right there, you can count them. The impression has been, I think in many people's minds, that the county was really, and the population was overwhelmingly embraced the Confederate cause. That's a bit of a misimpression. Because while 88/94 residents look like this guy, some 300 plus look like that guy. Except with one difference for 2/3 of them. What was the difference? Yeah, they didn't have a white skin. A third of them did, but 2/3 didn't. 2/3 were black. And they tended to wind up in largely, although not exclusively, in two regiments of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. Now, the USCT comes into being in 1863. Why 1863? What happens January 1st, 1863? The Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah. Now, there's a whole history leading up to that, but we're not going to get into that. And along with the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln determines we got 4.5 million people who are on our side. Well, maybe 3 of them aren't, but the other 4.5 million are. And by 1863, the war is maybe we're doing all right, but maybe we're getting our butts kicked. And good white boys are getting chewed up. And we have this population. Let's use them. And so that's exactly what happens. And it happens right here in Talbot County. And in fact, there are, if you read some of the letters or the diary of the Lloyds, old Edward Lloyd VII, he was a shrewdy, okay? He could read the writing on the wall. And so when these recruiters came to Talbot County in 1863, trying to drum up support among formerly enslaved people, or actually they were enslaved still, and free blacks as well. They didn't discriminate, saying, come on, fellas, join the army, see the world. What Lloyd did was he got a group of roughly 100 of his young enslaved population from the Y plantation, and he marched them down to the harbor to the recruiters and said, "Here, they're yours, take them." Now, he did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I suspect he never admitted this. He'd been wanting to get rid of these people all along. And here was a golden opportunity. And he got paid for it. He got paid for it. He got paid $7 a head or something for each recruit. He marched down. What a deal. Interestingly, to the credit of the officers who were in charge of these recruits at the end of the war in 1865, when these former Lloyd slaves, these guys, were discharged from the army, those officers went to bat, so to speak, for those recruits and said, "Hey, these guys, they deserve that money too." And they were given it. Some of them came back to Talbot County, and as we'll talk about next time, some of them used that money to buy homes with. So black recruits, they tended to cluster in the 4th and 7th USCT. And here's one member of the 4th USCT, Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, one of the original Medal of Honor recipients. Now, I came across him and I said, "Oh, great, a Talbot County black man, Union Medal of Honor recipient." And then I started reading about him. He's not from Talbot County. He's from Baltimore. But I left him up there anyway because his story is a great one. He was a free man in Baltimore, quite accomplished. He enlists in the Army in 1862, 1863, and he got the Medal of Honor for, I forget which battle it was at. It may have been Gettysburg, but it may not, may have been another one. For under ferocious fire, in which he was wounded 3 and 4 times, literally carrying back a wounded comrade back to Union lines. So he gets the Medal of Honor. Before we get to that, it's interesting to look at the impact of military service, if we're talking about the effects of the war, on these both white and black enlistees. Obviously, some of them got chewed up in the war, particularly the black recruits had fairly horrific mortality rates as a function of being in the Army. They had even worse rates than white recruits because of a couple of reasons. Number one, they were given the lousiest details. initially, black members of the U.S. Military during the Civil War were not allowed to fight. They weren't allowed to fight for the somewhat, here I am, sorry about that. They weren't allowed to fight, at least initially, because many white officers didn't think they would fight. You can't put a gun in their hands. Wouldn't know what to do with it. And what they'd probably do is throw it down and run the other way. Fighting is only for white men, because only white men are brave enough and heroic enough and smart enough to get slaughtered. And so they were given just god-awful duties. Go clean the latrines. That was a typical duty. And where do you want these black troops to put down their tents? Over there by the latrines. The white troops will be over here on the high ground. And as a result of that treatment, many of them got sick, many of them died. And if you look at their history after the Civil War, and again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but if you look at their history after the Civil War and see what occurred to them, many of them couldn't work after the Civil War because they had been so decimated by what they had experienced during the war. Interestingly, the two regiments, the 4th and the 7th USCT, that drew from Talbot County had a slightly different experience. They also got a lot of the crap work, but both of those regiments, in which had significant numbers of Talbot County residents, were given the honor of fighting. And because they were given that honor, many of them experienced what white troops experienced in combat. They got slaughtered.
There was a black regiment in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Recruited
Yeah.
volunteers, had a white officer.
Yeah.
And they had huge.
Yeah. Yeah. That was, what was the movie that was made of that?
Oregon.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful
Yeah.
statue. In
Yeah.
Staples.
Yeah. The example for the black troops from Talbot County was the battle, or actually it wasn't it was the siege of Petersburg. Petersburg, Virginia was under siege by the Union Army in 1864. It was one of the last bastions of Confederate strength. And Grant went crazy trying to penetrate Petersburg, and finally said, we're just going to lay siege to it and starve them out. And one of his officers came to him, a guy who had been in the coal mine business in Pennsylvania before the war, said, I got an idea. We need to do what I did in Pennsylvania in the anthracite mines. You tunnel under and you take this dynamite, and you put it underneath the fortification, and then you go, and the whole thing goes up in the air, and you have the troops rush in. So that's what they did. Okay? They blew it up, The fortifications went up in the air. Some Confederate soldiers went up in the air. Let's go, guys. I think it was the 7th Regiment, USCT, was given the honor of leading the charge. Except what they didn't count on was that this was a damn big hole. And so the troops went down into the hole and then said, okay, now what? How do we get up out of the hole? And by the time they started figuring out how to get up out of the hole, the Confederates had figured out what was going on, had come to their senses, and they simply ringed around the crater, as it was called, and did this. And then when they were done doing this, they went down into the crater and they did this until there was hardly a Union soldier left alive. That was not unique to Petersburg. These black troops knew damn well that if they were wounded and if they were captured, they weren't going to stay wounded. They were more than likely going to be executed. Very often, that's exactly what happened. That Confederates took the position that you are not soldiers. That's a contradiction in terms. You can't be black and a soldier. If you're black, you're inferior. If you're black, you're a slave. And if you've got a gun in your hand and you're a slave, you're involved in an act of rebellion, and rebellious slaves are executed. Now, some weren't. Some were simply taken down south and sold into slavery, irrespective of whether they had been slaves prior to the war or not. But one of the two happened. Okay. I like this picture because it gives a sense of what camp life was like for many Union troops. I think we have, at least I do, I can't speak for you, that military life was military, right? It was marching, it was training, and it was war, it was fighting. But when you read letters and diaries of these folks, 90% of it was just doing one or two things. Either marching from this place to that place, and then the next day being told, do it all over again in reverse, or sitting in a camp doing not much. And in this case, this fellow has even brought his whole family along with him into camp. Again, this is a Maryland soldier. I can't swear that he's from Talbot County, but it was not unusual for women and children to be in camp with these soldiers. Okay, moving on. How are we doing here? By 1864 or thereabouts, the war is pretty much it's not over, but the writing is on the wall by September, October of 1864. Even though Lincoln, somewhat famously, prior to the presidential election of 1864, was down in the dumps about his likelihood of being reelected. Lincoln was given to gloomy thoughts. He was somewhat famous for suffering from depression. But I think most observers, by the time that Petersburg was taken, by the time that Sherman's marched the sea, it burned Atlanta to the ground by September, it was the writing was on the wall, and it was just going to be a question of time as to when the war would be over. And in the election of 1864, here in Talbot County and other places throughout the South where the Union Army had taken control, there's an election. And it's interesting to take a look at what occurs in that election. Number one, in order to vote here in Talbot County, you had to sign this statement. And if you look down here at the bottom, you know, up here it says, did you ever serve in the rebel army? Well, you know, that seems to me a logical question to ask. If you were a rebel, maybe you shouldn't be voting in the election. In fact, if you were in the rebel army, maybe you should be in jail someplace or being shipped out to some island somewhere, which of course didn't happen. But they weren't about to let you vote in the election. But then you get down here, and if you can read this, are you a loyal citizen of the United States? Have you been loyal ever since the beginning of the war? And then the ones I really like. Have you ever rejoiced over the defeat of the Union Army? Have you ever rejoiced over the success of the rebel army? When the Union Army and the rebel army meet in battle, which do you wish to gain the victory? Oh, I got to think about that one. Obviously, and the folks who administered this loyalty oath didn't necessarily have to accept your answer. I don't know. You look, you know, you say you were loyal, but you got a rebel look to you. We're going to delve a little bit more deeply into that one. So this oath was used here in Talbot County and other places as a way of really rigging the election in 1864. Despite that, here in Talbot County, the vote was 1,020. Again, and this was, I should have prefaced this election was for the new Constitution that did away with slavery, okay? So the vote was 1,020 against doing away with slavery and 430 votes in favor. That's here in Talbot County, okay? Even with this loyalty oath being administered. So it's obvious that here in Talbot County, even as late as 1864, there was still a considerable number of folks who had not reconciled themselves to the fact that there was going to be a Union victory and that the Confederacy was on its way out. And even if there was going to be a Union victory, many of these folks had convinced themselves, okay, and life will go on. Life will go on. Nothing's going to change. Except, of course, as we'll talk about next time, a lot changed. But that was not the mindset of many people. All right. Whoops. So that's the last of those. But so what happens here in Talbot County is that even though there's a considerable pro-Confederate contingent, something happens to change the political complexion of the county shortly after the end of the Civil War. It's called the 14th and the 15th Amendments. What happens with the 14th? The 13th Amendment, everybody knows, right? That was the end of slavery. And that happened at the end of 1864. But 1865, 1866, you get the 14th and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says, come on. 14th Amendment says, excuse me? Not the 14th. The 14th says they were citizens. Okay, and the 15th said they can vote. And that changes the complexion of things. I'm sorry, folks. Here, I'm coming back. There I am. Okay. That changes the complexion of politics in Talbot County. And the interesting thing is that Talbot County seems to be unique in Maryland in this regard for much of the 19th century. And I don't want to overdo that. Maryland itself is unique among the southern states, because what occurs is that Black people in Talbot County vote. And not only do they vote in 1868 when they're given the vote for the first time, they vote in 1878 after the end of Reconstruction. And they vote in 1888 and 1898 and 1908 they vote. And by 1908, in Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina and Louisiana and just about every other part of the South, if you were a Black man in 1908, the last thing you were going to be doing was voting, because you took your life in your hands in many of those areas if you voted, but not here in Talbot County. Here in Talbot County, Black people continue to vote in large numbers, upwards of 90% turnout in presidential, 90%. If we get 50% nowadays. In fact, so many Blacks voted that the Democrats, white people, they really got pissed off. What's going on here? So, I'm going to read to you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to read to you. This is an article I wrote. It's a great article. Great article. Democratic efforts to combat Black Republican voting largely consisted, here in Talbot County, largely consisted of calls for white voters to adhere to the color line, while castigating African-American voters as, quote, I love this one, black vomit. That was a newspaper editorial right here in Talbot County, black vomit. Typical of this approach was you'll love this, a Star Democrat editorial in 1871. It said, the Democrats, the white people, in the several districts here in Talbot County must go to work and bring every man to the polls. Every white man will be needed to keep the country, to keep the county in white hands. The newspaper's concern was justified. In 1881, 10 years later, it lamented that, quote, the Negroes are always on hand to register and vote. Democrats are often indifferent about registering and voting. If there was a new registration of voters ordered, every Negro would promptly go and register, while hundreds of white men would not take the trouble to register. God damn. The Eastern Ledger, another newspaper, another Democratic newspaper, concurred, stating that a black voter, unlike his white counterpart, enjoyed the process of registering and voting. Quote, it is indicative to the black voter of his power as a voter, if not suggestive of his responsibility as a citizen. It is a display of his equality before the law. So, certainly that, the end result of that was that here in Talbot County, even though the Democratic Party pretty much held sway in most elections, there was always a sizable Republican vote. And because there was always a sizable Republican vote throughout the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, the Democrats, who pretty much ruled everywhere else in the South and could do pretty much whatever they wanted to do, however they wanted to do it, could not engage in similar behavior here in Maryland as a whole, and in particular here in Talbot County, because of this sizable block of Republican votes, most, not all, but most of which were black votes. So one effect of the war, among many others. So that's as far as I wanted to go today. If you have some questions, if you have criticisms, afterwards talk to Lynn. No, but if you do have questions.
In your article, don't you talk in there about how, yes, the blacks voted in large group, but it was the candidates were always white, they would not allow black candidates.
Yeah. The sad part was that the folks in the Republican Party in Talbot County who called the shots were white. And so they were more than happy to have blacks vote. And they even once in a while would let a black person run for office, but not very much. I wrote another article about two black fellows who took part in this process in Trapp and in Easton, Joe Gray and Nace Hopkins. And both guys worked their butts off for the Republican Party in the hopes that they'd be rewarded in some way. And it didn't happen for either one of them. Both of them died poor and reasonably unlamented by the turn of the century. I'm glad somebody read Mark. God, good for you. All right. Anything else?
Any other questions?
No question. All right. Well, next time, we're going to look at some of the economic and social, beyond what we talked about today, impacts of the war here in Talbot County. And we'll show you pictures of tractors and other just exciting stuff that's going to titillate you no end. Okay? All right. Very good. Thank you very much. And thank you for bearing with us.